All right, everyone. Welcome into Mark Rogers TV's Office Hours is what I was thinking about calling this. Our first live stream that's not directly related to a particular game in terms of instant analysis. If you joined us throughout the college football season, we provided instant analysis of all the huge games right after the completion of each game. But this is our first live stream. In terms of having some interaction with you, we've got the live chat open. So if you'd like to jump in, make your questions and comments, and we'll talk some college football right here. Of course, the national championship game is coming up on Monday night in Atlanta, Georgia, Alabama, an all SEC final. The Crimson Tide, a 4 to 4.5 point favorite right now, looking for their fifth national championship under Nick Saban in just 9 years. Georgia coming off, of course, one of the more historic and exciting Rose Bowls, 54-48 double overtime win right there. Also, while we're waiting for some people to jump on board right here, would like to let you know that we've got a number of team reports coming up here on Mark Rogers TV. We talked to Black Shoe Diaries on SB Nation about Penn State football, reviewing the bowl season, looking at the prospects for 2018, the recruiting class, and so forth there with Black Shoe Diaries. Michigan and Steve Dace does a great job at Michigan Podcast. Had him on last night, and Steve has been very optimistic about the trajectory of the Michigan program despite losing some of the big games since Jim Harbaugh has been there. He's excited about where this program is headed until he saw that collapse in the second half of the Outback Bowl against South Carolina. So Steve is now concerned, and he has some good reasons why the Michigan narrative may have changed drastically in the last 30 days. Also talking South Carolina football today with Will Gunter from 107.5 The Game in Columbia, South Carolina, with the Gamecocks coming off the big win over Michigan in the Outback Bowl, coming back from 19 to 3 down, scoring 23 consecutive points to win it, 26-19. If you caught us throughout 2017, you may believe this if you watch a number of videos, that we had 98 media guests on Mark Rogers TV throughout 2017. Think about that. Where can you go for college football coverage and get the perspective from 98 credentialed media, legitimate media guests, contributors on one channel? Peter Burns from the SEC Network, Jerry DiNardo from the Big Ten Network. We had Phil Steele on as well. Of course, our regular guests and contributors from a number of SB Nation platforms, from 247 Sports, like Brad Crawford and others. We also did a series last spring in which we talked to some of the top recruits in college football and discussed their decision-making process. And some of these have turned out to be at the very top of the class for 2018. Justin Fields, the number one quarterback in the country, going to Georgia. He joined us on Mark Rogers TV about 8 or 9 months ago. BJ Foster, the number one safety in high school football, has committed and signed with Texas. He joined us for an interview several months back. Yabi Anoma, a kid who's only played high school football since his junior season, who is now signed with Alabama, and he joined us for a nice interview several months back. It's been announced here in the last few days that Tyreek Smith, who is considered Notre Dame, Penn State, Michigan State, has settled on Ohio State and expects to sign there. And Tyreek Smith joined us for an interview, in the last few months. And of course, from watching us on a regular basis that we get around to all the Power 5 conferences and hit the major teams and try to get to everybody as possible, as much as possible. And that brings me to the content part of this. So I go with what I believe is the hot topics and try to cover college football extensively. Would love to hear from you in terms of what topics you would like to hear us present on a regular basis. So once we close the books on 2017 after the national championship game on Monday night, here are some of the videos I'm working on. The top 10 bowls So we've got 41 bowl games, the top 10 for 2017, the top 10 offenses in 2017, the top 10 defenses. I'm sure that will cause quite a debate. An 8-team playoff, which seems rather cut and dry for 2017. So if you watch me at all, you understand that I am not a fan of the 14 playoff. And there's one reason and one reason why. Because we've got 5 major conferences, as I try to stay logged in on my other laptop to check out the live chat to see if we have anything. Excuse me. So we've got 5 conferences, 5 major conferences, the Power 5, but we've got 4 playoff spots. And then if we're going to select 2 teams from one conference, we really have an issue, as we did this year, leaving out 2 conferences. That's not an argument to say that, in particular this year, that Ohio State and USC are as good or better than the teams in the 4-team playoff. The argument is fair and equal representation across the country in those particular conferences. So we'll talk that up as well. And we'll look at what an 8-team playoff would have looked like, not just in 2017, but in 2016 and going backwards. It's all conjecture. We're never going to know, but it's a fun debate to look at what may have happened had we allowed all the conferences to be represented, let alone the Central Florida situation. So I cut a video on Central Florida, of course. They have taken this situation into their own hands. They have thrown the parade, or will be throwing the parade, I believe, on Monday, maybe trying to upstage the national championship game, which, of course, they're not going to upstage the national championship game, but they will be shaking things up a bit and already have. Their athletic director, Dan White, making some rather controversial comments about the quality of their team and maybe not so much the quality of some of their competitors of sorts in this national championship discussion. But Central Florida, I say more power to you. I congratulate them for the only undefeated season, excuse me, in FBS football. 130 teams compete. They are the only one to have completed this season undefeated. They are the one. And I know the competition wasn't what you would have seen in one of the Power 5 conferences, but when they were given the opportunity against an Auburn team that, just remember how we viewed Auburn 4 weeks ago. At that point, we believed the Auburn Tigers to possibly be the best team in college football. And the College Football Playoff Committee, which most people are applauding right now because they got it right by selecting Alabama, and Alabama going out and defeating the number 1 team, Clemson, handily in the second half, 24-6, that the College Football Playoff Committee got it right. Well, that same College Football Playoff Committee thought after the regular season that Auburn was the second best team in college football. That's what they believed. And what happens a month later is that Central Florida defeats Auburn. And ironically, not only does Central Florida make the claim that, hey, we're the only undefeated team, give us something, let us declare our national championship, but it's just ironic that this happened in a situation in which Central Florida defeated the only team that defeated both teams to play in the national championship game. So I love what Central Florida is doing. Do I think they're the best team in the country? I do not. I don't necessarily believe they're one of the 10 best teams in the country. I believe there's something in that. They're somewhere in that range. They're one of the 8 to 15 best teams in the country. That would be my estimate. But they should have been given the opportunity to play for a national championship. And the way to do that is to represent the conferences. And so we saw it play out again this year, in which a deserving team was left out. And I'm not even talking about Ohio State or USC. I'm talking about Central Florida. If we have an 18 playoff, then we can always represent the group of 5. Think about this. The group of 5 must be the only competitive sport in this country on any level from high school on up that cannot play for a state championship or a national championship. You go to any sport, you go to any division at the collegiate ranks and certainly professionally, and you can play for the championship. It's like the College Football Playoff Committee has an obligation to go out during summer camp when all these kids are out fighting through the 95-degree heat and throwing their guts up during 2-a-days each and every day, that the College Football Playoff Committee or whoever devised this playoff system should go out to all the group of 5 schools, gather the team together, and say, we appreciate your efforts, but understand that there is no chance in hell that you're going to play for a national championship. Even if you win every game 50-0, you are not going to play for a national championship. So it's not going to happen anytime soon, but there would be a reasonable way to go with an 18 playoff. I invite you guys to join in on the chat. I am monitoring the live feed. Would love to stop just talking endlessly and answer some questions and respond to some comments. So I'm sure you have some things to say about, of course, Monday night's game, Alabama, Georgia, the tied a 4-point favorite. Can Alabama's run defense that was so good against Clemson, but showed some weak spots with some banged up linebackers against the likes of Mississippi State and Auburn? What can they do against Nick Chubb, Sony Michel, and DeAndre Swift? Those boys tore it up against Oklahoma, but they're facing a completely different deal against Alabama. Of course, Jake Fromm, much more of a pocket presence and more of a polished passer than what Alabama faced on Monday night against Clemson. And so that poses a different threat. It's just a completely different dynamic of a game going from Clemson to Georgia, at least from the offensive side. Georgia has the same speed at the running back position with 3 deep instead of the 2 deep of Travis Etienne and Tavian Feaster with Clemson, but they bring so much power between the tackles in comparison to those guys. And then again, Kelly Bryant limited in the passing game, and Jake Fromm, a much more polished passer, will give the Alabama defense something to think about. All right, so we can talk national championship game. We can talk about some of the teams that I've highlighted in recent days on Mark Rogers TV as I try to put a cap on 2017 and look forward to 2018 in analyzing personnel losses, personnel gains, development of players, tons of changes in coaching staffs, not just the head coach with a lot of these teams, but the coordinators and the coaching staffs. And we've already knocked out Michigan, Penn State, and South Carolina. Looking forward to giving you reports on Miami, Clemson, Virginia Tech, Ohio State, Florida, Mississippi State, USC, Iowa. Those are all set up, and we'll bring you much more. As you can see, with 5,000 videos, I get to just about as much as I possibly can. And I will possibly do what I did about a year ago, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, and that's talk to the top recruits in high school football. And again, if you want to see those and check out those interviews, Justin Fields, BJ Foster, Yabi Anoma, Tyreek Smith, and some of the best high school football players, we did those about 9 months ago. So just go to Mark Rogers TV, hit the subscribe button. Do me a favor, hit the subscribe button if you love college football and want to get the first word from some of the best bloggers and broadcasters, including myself. I jump in with the analysis as well right here at Mark Rogers TV. So please subscribe and we will deliver. I mentioned coaching staff changes. Just here today, we understand that LSU offensive coordinator Matt Canada been shown the door rather nicely with $3.1 million in his pocket, as that was the settlement based on the buyout. Michigan State loses its defensive coordinator, Harlan Barnett, former defensive end for the Cleveland Browns, going to Florida State. Missouri and Barry Odom has a new offensive coordinator to handle that high-flying offense. Derek Dooley, former Tennessee coach, takes over the offense. He's coming from his wide receiver post with the Dallas Cowboys. And of course, Josh Heupel was the last Missouri offensive coordinator who is now trying to uh, take over that Central Florida team with a tough act to follow in Scott Frost, who took an 0-12 team 2 years ago. What a roller coaster ride. Think about this. Central Florida goes from defeating Baylor, being one of those group of fives that gets entry into the New Year's Six, defeats Baylor, who was one of the top 5 or 6 teams in the country in the rankings, and wins a Fiesta Bowl. They go from that height to losing George O'Leary, their head coach, to 0-12. Scott Frost comes in. They go from 0-12, back up the ladder to the only undefeated team in college football, 13-0, and defeating Auburn, who just lost the SEC championship game in the Peach Bowl. What a ride from Central Florida. I only liken it to what Auburn pulled off with Gus Malzahn at the helm several years ago, when, of course, Auburn went from national champion in 2010 to 3-8 or 3-9, 0-8 in the SEC in 2012, and then to the national championship game the next year. Those are the two biggest roller coaster rides. If you have other ones that you can think of where a team has gone from the top of the world to the basement, back up to the top within a couple of years, what Auburn did, yes, under Gus Malzahn initially was pretty amazing there. All right, we've got a few people jumping in. So Jamal Dawson mentions that we could go with a 16 playoff and 2 of the teams get a bye. And I believe, Jamal, I'm going to guess that the reason why you're suggesting a 6-team over the 18 is I think a lot of people that want to see the very, very best college football teams involved and think that we water it down the more we add. And of course we do. You believe that by going with 6 instead of the 8, then we don't water it down as much as we would if we add the 2 other teams. Okay, the only issue I've got with the 16 playoff, because you do include all 5 conferences that way theoretically, is that you've got to award 2 byes. And I have difficulty doing that. So let's say this year we've got the 4 teams that we currently have. Then we add, who would we add? Ohio State and Central Florida? Let's say we add Ohio State and Central Florida. Who gets the 2 byes? Okay. It would seem to be the conference champions that only had 1 loss would be the most obvious teams that we would throw in with the byes. So we've got this year Clemson with 1 loss. We've got Oklahoma with 1 loss, and we've got, of course, Georgia with 1 loss. So you got 3 teams, but you got 2 byes. Who would you give the byes to? That would be a tricky situation, one that I don't like, because the teams with the byes have a huge advantage over the rest of the field. All right, so we've got, who is this? Jumping in with the 14 playoff. You like the 14 playoff if the committee gets it right. So I'm going to ask you, Jinker GM, if you believe the committee got it right, not just this season, but going back to 2014, 15, and 16. Do you believe the committee got it right? I have stated and I've been really hard on the committee this particular year, and I think people have taken that wrong. Number one, they've taken it as me being an Ohio State homer, and what they need to realize is that last year, I could pull up the videos. Please, you dig into the videos, search Penn State playoff, and you'll see where last year I was saying that Ohio State, despite their resume in beating 3 of the top 10 teams in the country, did not earn the right to be in the playoff, and Penn State did. I was campaigning for Penn State in 2016. So it's not me being an Ohio State homer. It's me wanting a playoff situation where we can represent all the conferences. Now, we don't have that. So I have said from day one that the College Football Playoff Committee has an impossible task. So I credit them. I believe that for the first few years that they did their due diligence in trying to set up a criteria that was reasonable, logical, and understandable for everyone in trying to get the 4 best teams. And I believe that that's a myth trying to figure out who the four best teams are. It's easy to say after the fact, oh, those were the four best teams. But determining that in the moment, we can't play God and say who the four best teams are. But I believe they did their due diligence to at least line up a criteria that was understandable to say, okay, maybe I don't agree with it, but I can understand why they selected those four teams. I could see that in 2014 and 15. In 16, because of the Penn State-Ohio State situation, it became a little bit more murky at that point, but I could see the point. I didn't agree with it. I wanted Penn State with the Big Ten champion in the playoff, but I at least understood that Ohio State had one less loss and that they had defeated a team in Oklahoma that finished in the top 5 in the country that was a much better win than what Penn State provided against Pitt out of conference. So that's where I understood the 2016 decision. I didn't agree with it, but I understood it. And now here in 2017, this is not saying that Alabama will not win the national championship or they're not the best team or one of the four best teams. This is talking more to the point that Ohio State earned it or USC earned it above Alabama. I value the conference championship. And in Ohio State's case, they had a much better win resume than Alabama. Yes, they had the just ridiculous loss against Iowa, losing by 31 points on the road, a game that nobody can understand, that certainly has to be taken into consideration. And it cost Ohio State. There's no question about that. But it was never taken into consideration by the committee or most college football analysts that I listened to. You only heard it right here that this point should have been taken into consideration. Ohio State beat Wisconsin, the number 4 team in the country, Penn State, the number 8 or 9 team in the country. So they had 2 wins, much better than Alabama's best win. So 2 wins versus 0 in that top 10 category. Then Ohio State's third best win was against Michigan State, a top 15 team. And Alabama's best win was arguably about the same as Ohio State's third best win, Michigan State versus LSU or Mississippi State. Okay. I'll get to you in just a second, Jinker GM. So the point that I'm making here is the quality of the win based on opponent, but also number 2, the quality of the win based on the dominance of the win. So if you're going to hold a team accountable for a loss to the extent that Ohio State was held accountable for the Iowa loss, not just being to Iowa, but being that bad to Iowa, then you have to do the same thing with the wins. And Ohio State's dominance against Michigan State, 48-3, a game that could have been 70-3. They were up 35-0 in the second quarter. That was never given the consideration and placed against Alabama, defeating like teams, LSU and Mississippi State, but barely beating them. Mississippi State in the last 45 seconds. So Alabama made the case to schedule cupcakes and still getting in. The one place where I understand Alabama takes a hit on the schedule is the Mercer game, the second to last game of the season. I think that's overblown. Alabama scheduled Florida State. Florida State did not turn out to be nearly as good as they were expected to be. That cannot be Alabama's fault, but it still has to be weighted how good the teams are on the schedule. And then also we have to consider that Alabama did play Fresno State, which was a very, very good group of 5 team that went to its conference championship game. So we've got 4 or 5 viewers on right now. Would love to have you chime in on the live chat. I will get to your questions and comments and continue to talk about what we've got coming up here on Mark Rogers TV. Jamal Dawson writes, the only team really in question was Alabama. And you're with what seems to be the majority, Jamal, that Alabama was one of the 4 best teams. And if you're just going to select the 4 best teams, and if we took a nationwide poll of college football fans and said, even before what we saw against Clemson and with Georgia and Oklahoma, going back to following championship conference weekend, and said, I'm guessing that if we polled the nation, college football nation, and said at that point, who were the four best teams, they would have said the four teams that got into the playoffs. So I understand that if it's simply who you think are the four best teams, then the playoff committee needs to come out and say, you know what? We are selecting the four best teams regardless of criteria. And they would have definitely made a different decision in 2015. In 2015, Michigan State won the Big Ten. Ohio State was undoubtedly one of the four best teams, if not the best team in the country. They lost at the gun against Michigan State. Now, again, I'm not saying they should have been in the playoff because Michigan State earned it. What I'm saying is if you're selecting just the best teams, well, Ohio State had the most talented roster in college football. They produced the NFL Rookie of the Year and the NFL Offensive and Defensive Rookies of the Year for the next season. They were definitely the most talented roster, but they got left out, and for good reason. They didn't win the Big Ten championship. So I appreciate you jumping on board. Unless we're going to have some more live chat comments, I'll probably shut down in just a minute. But if anybody's watching that has not subscribed, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. As you can see, we provide quantity, but mostly quality analysis from myself and the best bloggers and broadcasters in the industry. Coming up in the next several weeks, I hope to get to the top 10 bowls 2017, the top 10 offenses, the top 10 defenses, an 8-team playoff for this season, what that would have looked like. And then I'm most excited to get to my playoff system, also my scheduling formula. So this is key, is the scheduling. And a lot of you brought it up here about Alabama scheduling Mercer and what about the non-conference games. The scheduling needs to be taken out of the hands of the individual schools that have their own agendas. There needs to be a formula for scheduling. And I've got the formula. I will release that in the next few weeks. Jinker GM writes, I'm disappointed that the national championship game is the SEC championship again, with the best conference being the Big Ten. The Big Ten certainly, Jinker GM, has a claim to best conference based on the showing against the other teams in the bowls. And that's another subject I was going to bring up tonight, best conference. It's a tough one to get a hold of. I think for the first time in a long, long time, before SEC dominance in the mid to late 2000s, there is a legitimate argument as to best conference, and it is a tough one to settle. And that's another thing. I'm glad you brought that up, because this is going to be another point of content, another video I'm going to create that's going to take a little bit of time, but I do this each and every off season. I rank the conferences, and the way I do that is I take all the Power 5 games played between the conferences. That's usually about 15 to 20 games per conference that they play against the other Power 5 conferences. And then I give points based on the results of the games. So, for example, Oklahoma beat Ohio State, and I do a 14-point system because there's 14 teams in the 3 big conferences, and then I've got to adjust the points based on there only being 10 in the Big 12 and 12 in the Pac-12. But it works out. The math works out. So Oklahoma beats Ohio State. Give 14 points plus 14 points to the Big 12, negative 14 points to the Big 10, including the bowl games. Yes, we threw the bowl games in there as well. Definitely. The bowl games, actually, Jinker GM, I believe, even though people question motivation of teams and incentive and say they're exhibition games, how can they be exhibition games when they're included on the team's records? They're not exhibition games. I think the bowl games are actually the truest barometer of how good the conferences are against each other. And this is the reason why, because it's the only time during the entire season that we have like-seeded teams playing each other from different conferences. So, for example, Oklahoma State played Pitt during the regular season. That was their big non-conference game. Well, Oklahoma State was the second or third best team in the Big 12, Pitt was like the 11th or 12th best team in the ACC. That was not a like-seeded matchup. We couldn't gain a whole lot from that. We couldn't evaluate those teams. We had very rare is a like-seeded team play a like-seeded team from another conference in the regular season. Ohio State, Oklahoma, it happened there. Alabama, Florida State should have been one, but that didn't turn out to be because Florida State lost 6 games. So how I adjust the point system for those games, for example, Alabama's the 1 seed in the SEC. Florida State's I haven't done the standings yet, but let's say they're the 8th seed in the ACC. Well, Alabama would get credit 14 points for defeating the 1 seed, which they did, Clemson in the ACC. But I take off the 8 points for the 8 places in the standings that Florida State is down, and Alabama in the SEC get 6 points for the win, and Florida State in the ACC get -6 for the loss, if you follow me there. I will explain the whole deal. You can go back and search last offseason, the offseason before I did the same thing, did a full whiteboard, and we'll do it up big. So we're going to rank the conferences. Of course, before or just after the national championship game, we'll provide analysis of the game, but also have our final top 25. And I really want to get to a mailbag. So similar to what we're doing right now in talking to all of you and having this live chat and answering comments and questions is to go through the mailbag. So I had almost 7,000 comments come to Mark Rogers TV in 2017. That's compared to 1,200 the previous year. So I hope to increase it like that next year and have 20 or 25,000 comments. And I try to respond to as many as possible. You probably catch that I try to get to as many as possible. But I would like to do that on video and provide a Mark Rogers TV mailbag. So we will get to that as well. All right, folks, please subscribe to my YouTube channel for the very best in college football coverage. And if you have any more comments, please make them quickly. Any comments or questions? Otherwise, I'm going to shut things down. And throughout the weekend, I will have analysis of the national championship game. Also, a lot on Penn State, Michigan, and South Carolina. All right, Jinker GM, we will catch you next time. Jamal Dawson, thanks for your comments as well. We will see you next time right here on Mark Rogers TV.